Next, we will have Max Lane, who is an Australian political analyst with Red Ant, and he specializes in Southeast Asian geopolitics. He's also written extensively on the political dynamics of Indonesia, which I think yesterday, which is today for some people in the call, was the independence anniversary of Indonesia, 17 August 1945. And so we invite you, Max, to give your inputs on the region coming from your perspective in Australia. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. It's very good to be able to speak immediately after Corazon, because I agree very much that we have to put a lot of focus on what's happening in the Philippines. I think the Philippines is a safer trigger point for the US to use than Taiwan. And I would expect that the incidents between the Philippines or the US in the Philippines and China in the oceans there will increase. But back to Australia, I'm going to talk primarily about Australia's position in all this. Way down here, as they say, down under, this weird 25 million strong, mainly white settler country. Although these days, at least 50% of the population has parents or themselves have been born outside of Australia. The first thing to note, as I'm sure you're all aware actually, but need to emphasize it, is that Australia is a full member of the global imperialist club and has been so for 150 years. Its high GDP, its prosperity and wealth has flown directly from its integration into the global imperialist club and its domination of the economic domination of the world. And Australia itself, even though quite a small economy relative to the other imperialist economies, still has big investments in global south countries, including in Indonesia, but also as far as away in South America, in Chile. And of course, the extra thing to note here is that this high GDP per capita that Australia has not only comes from sharing in the exploitation by the imperialist bloc of the global south, it also comes from all that initial wealth accumulated as a result of the genocidal invasion initially by British colonialists that enabled the theft of the whole continent from the indigenous people of this continent. And as a consequence of its membership in this global imperialist club, in foreign and security policy, the Australian state and the majority of the capitalist class have always shared the same strategic interests as the imperialist bloc as a whole. And since World War II in particular, the strategic interests of the United States. In fact, prior to World War II, Australia did not even have control over its own foreign policy. In terms of how this all relates to relationship with Asia, again and again, this foreign and security policy orientation, with the Australian state seeing its interests as being the same as with the imperialist bloc as a whole, has led to, first of all, since the end of World War II, and then after the Chinese Revolution, even more so, there's always been a massive propaganda campaign amongst the Australian people about the yellow peril. The yellow peril from China, from communist China, then has often been signified on maps with China painted yellow, but a red arrow going down towards Australia via Southeast Asia. And not surprisingly, within this framework, Australian troops were involved with the US in South Korea, Malaya, Indonesia, and of course later on an even bigger scale in Vietnam. And it's important for comrades to know here that even prior to the US committing to the war in Vietnam, the Australian government was actually already urging the US to get involved. So it wasn't a matter of Australia following the US, but actually urging the US to get involved in Vietnam. So what about today? Well, Corazon also already mentioned the number of agreements that Australia has with the US and also with the Philippines, Japan, and so on, which is integrating it into the US's aggressive policy of containment of China. Of course, the crucial one is AUKUS, the treaty or the agreement whereby Australia is going to buy nuclear-powered submarines from the United Kingdom and from the United States. And this agreement actually goes beyond just the purpose, just the buying of the submarines. It actually has a number of other aspects to it, which are all aimed at increasing the interoperability of the Australian armed forces with the US forces. Of course, there can't be complete political integration of the US and Australian armed forces, but it's getting closer and closer to that. Australia becomes a part of the whole US force projection up north towards the Chinese coast. And as far as I mentioned, Australia is also in Quad and Squad. The city of Darwin in northern Australia has been opened up to use by US forces, including planes that can possibly be carrying nuclear weapons. And of course, as you would all know, Australia has long housed very important bases for US spy satellite systems. And on a bilateral basis, there's a whole range of agreements that Corazon mentioned with the Philippines, and there's similar agreements with Indonesia. In fact, the president-to-be, General Prabowo Subianto, will become president in Indonesia in October. He's now Minister of Defence. He'll be coming to Canberra, Australia, to sign an updating of the military agreements security agreements between Canberra and Jakarta, I think next month or very soon. And of course, this whole signing of AUKUS, being involved in all AUKUS, Squad, opening up Darwin, etc., is all part of the reality that the Australian capitalist class shares the same understanding of the global politics in terms of the primary axis at the moment being the intensification of the global North's desire, plan, activity to increase its hegemony over the global South. It shares that outlook, whether it's on the relationship with Asia or the relationship with what's happening, for example, in Palestine. And of course, what's playing a key role in all this is the increased capacity of China to resist efforts to reinforce US hegemony. It's not at the stage where China can defeat it, but it's resisting it, and that resistance is seen as a threat, not only by the US, but by the Australian capitalist class. So as a result, in Australia now, it just rolls off the newsreader's tongue. Whenever they're talking about news, China is just referred to as an adversary. It's just become part of the mainstream of current affairs political culture. China is an adversary. And that language gets even more intense when there's discussion of what's happening in what Australian imperialists considers its own backyard, the South Pacific Islands. Then any involvement by China becomes is depicted as even more threatening when it has no military or security implications at all. Well, in the Australian case, there are contradictions for the capitalist class in this hostile attitude towards China. For Australian capital, China is crucial. Over the past 5 years, the exports of Australia to China have increased at an annualized rate of almost 8% per year, from $85 billion US dollars in 2017 to 123 billion in 2022. China almost always tops the list of countries that import goods from Australia. It's extremely important for big sections of Australian capital. And at the moment, the new Labor government that came to power last year is doing all it can to improve business ties with China, including inviting the Premier of China to come to Australia, where he was feted, state dinners, etc., and the whole aim was to open up more commercial relations, and that has improved a lot. So there's a contradiction here. At the one time, in politics, in the political sphere, anti-Chinese propaganda continues very strongly by all segments of the capitalist class, with the occasional dissent. Probably the most well-known source of dissent is from the former Labor Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who's been a very assertive critic of AUKUS, and also being seen as outside the mainstream way of looking at things by insisting that Taiwan belongs to China. Taiwan is Chinese real estate. That's his term. Stop agitating around the Taiwan question, he says. Now that's dissent, a little bit of dissent, one person really from within the Australian political elite. But what about outright opposition to these policies? I think basically the outright opposition only comes from elements in the Australian left. And you can perhaps see two major streams. I'm simplifying here things just to squeeze it in, but you can see two mainstreams. One is a kind of moderate left, or left of centre, or some people would even say centrist party, or liberal democratic party, or whatever, which is the Greens party in Australia, which has some members in the Senate and a couple of members in the House of Representatives, or one member, I think, a couple of members in the House of Representatives. It completely opposes AUKUS, this AUKUS treaty, but in its propaganda and education and explanation, its emphasis is on that it's a waste of money to buy nuclear submarines, that erodes Australia's defence sovereignty, handing it over to the US, and also talks about the environmental impacts of storage of nuclear waste from such submarines. It does publish some statements on China, stating that China is not a threat and arguing for more cooperation, but it's not something it stresses in its major statements or campaigns. It's more on the waste of money aspect and the erosion of defence sovereignty. And also the Green Party does not initiate or lead mass campaigns or protests. It's strictly an electoral or parliamentary body. The other stream relates to the peace movement and the socialist left or the far left. There is an anti-AUKUS coalition in Australia, and there is an independent and peaceful Australia network. They're both very active, but they are small and very weak, with very minimal public profile or impact. This is a result of the fact that there's been a 20-year decline of the radical left in Australia, especially a decline of those groups whose political perspective is based on seeing the main contradiction in global politics now between that being the global north versus the global south, that is imperialism. Groups on the left that really emphasize that and have that as their starting point are very, very, very weak. And also, perhaps connected to this smallness and weakness, is that one of the statements put out by the peace movement groups in Australia also tends to emphasise the waste of money, the erosion of defence sovereignty. There's no anybody really who campaigns emphasising, the main point: China is simply not an enemy, or something similar to that. Nor does it educate on seeing the US containment of China today is linked to the general global north versus global south dynamic that's central today. I just want to end by making one point, which I think is very important. Australia I suppose it's Australia is a country which is fully integrated into the imperialist camp. I think it would be great benefit to the movement in the region as a whole if this small imperialist country that plays a very high profile, if not doesn't have a big military role, but I think it plays as a high political profile role in the US plans. I think there is potential for what is a weak and small movement now to grow. Part of this just means more hard work by the activists building the movement, especially the new young people coming into the movement. Just the hard work of patiently explaining and helping build actions when that opportunity arises. But one thing that would help, and I just echoing what Corazon also said, I think in the Australian context, if we can increase the voices of the people movements of Asia in Australia itself, I think that would actually give a big boost to the movement here. At the moment, we've become isolated from hearing what progressive people in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, and Northeast Asia, what they think and say. Almost no presence. If we can boost that, I think that would be a big help. One of the groups I'm involved in, Red Ant, but I'm also a senior fellow at Tricontinental Institute too. One of the things we're doing is organizing a speaking tour to 4 Australian cities for the Tricontinental director, Vijay Prasad, in October, November. But I think that'd be great if there were more visits to Australia by Asian friends to educate people here about the situation, the destabilizing effect of the US in the Asian region, and how that fits into the overall imperialist political situation that we face today. It might be hard to do that in terms of resources and infrastructure and so on, because the movements are small, the groups here are small and weak. But I think it is urgent, and it would be really very useful to hear Asian voices more strongly reflected in Australia. I'll finish there.
Fully agreed. Thank you so much, Max. I think important contributions there, and also echoing, as you said with Corazon, that we need to find ways in which we can increase exchange amongst people in the region. I just want to again highlight that Corazon mentioned that in September there will be the Asian Peoples Forum, which I think we will definitely be sharing and retweeting and ensuring that we have more people participating in that, whether in person or online. And that agreed, we need to find out ways with our limited resources to get our people to talk to one another, because unfortunately we know the huge arsenal of media apparatus and infrastructure that the US and Western aligned organizations continue to totally dominate the conversation, and we need to find our alternatives. And I mean, if it was possible for revolutions to be led in primitive Russia in 1917, I think with all the resources we have in terms of communication tools, we can figure out a way. So thank you so much, Max.